Hi, everyone. I'm Greg Rashuni, and I'm the Executive Director of the Aspen Institute's Energy and Environment Program. The Energy and Environment Program has been gathering people to discuss environmental and energy topics for more than 50 years. Today, our program is designed around solving the climate crisis, and our work is broken down into three parts: mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions and other pollutants, adaptation to a warming planet, and building relationships for the cooperation needed to solve this crisis. Many of our convenings bring experienced executives and professionals together for several days to discuss a particular topic, like decarbonizing the electricity system or how to prepare coastal communities for rising seas and more powerful storms. But the conclusion we came to about a year and a half ago was that the work that we as a planet are doing today, things like getting governments to start taking the first steps on climate action, research and development, on needed technologies, and building the technologies that are ready to deploy today, like wind, solar, and electric vehicles, and starting to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels is actually really easy compared to the challenges that we're going to face in 5, 10, or 20 years. Solving climate crisis is going to take more than one big push. It's going to be an uphill battle, and we're going to have to fight for every inch. So we created the Future Leaders Climate Summit, a gathering that was scheduled to take place 2 weeks ago, but for obvious reasons has been postponed to the fall, to bring together what we're calling future leaders. While we set age parameters for the application to this particular summit, the idea here is to help prepare the people who will be in decision-making roles down the road when we have these even tougher actions to take. Whether it's people who will be working at nonprofits or foundations, future policymakers in local, national, or international government and institutions, or corporate leaders, we want to give this group the knowledge, skills, and the networks so that they can be better prepared to make smart decisions over the next 30 years than we have over the last 30, and so that we can solve the climate crisis. For those of you who are Future Leaders Climate Summit participants, we're looking forward to talking with you over the coming months as we approach the summit this fall. And for those of you interested in getting more involved in our program, please reach out to Energy and Environment at aspeninstitute.org or follow us on Twitter at AI Environment. You should also check out our other upcoming virtual exchanges, including next Wednesday, where we're hosting an Earth Day event featuring former Secretary of Energy, Ernest Moniz, as well as our new series, Innovators in Blank, which will be a bi-weekly series featuring innovators in the climate space. It kicks off April 29th with Melissa Roberts from the American Flood Coalition. So check all these out on our website. So one technical thing is if you have a question for the panel, use the Q&A feature at the bottom, or you can email us. And with that, I'd like to introduce our first discussant, Bill McKibben. So can we bring Bill onto the screen? All right. Bill is an author and environmentalist, and the 2014 Right Livelihood Prize winner. He's written more than a dozen books, including The End of Nature, and is a founder of 350.org, the first planet-wide grassroots climate change movement organization, which has held more than 20,000 rallies around the world. Welcome, Bill.
Well, a pleasure to be with you, Greg, and everybody else.
So let's start with how are you doing, and what does social distancing look like for you, and how are you handling it?
Well, we're very lucky. You know, I live in the woods. I've spent my whole life living deep in rural America, which is a good place for a writer because it's cheap to live, and it's a good place to live anyway because it's great. And so if there has to be a place to go through stuff like this, this is as easy as possible spot, you know. We've got endless woods to roam in without any danger of, I mean, even the bears are likely to stay 6 feet away from you. So it's, you know, very few issues like that. And of course, this is such a strange crisis that we're in, because our impulse always correctly in crises is to go help each other. Rebecca Solnit wrote that wonderful book, Paradise Built in Hell, just about the way that human beings instinctively almost gather and help in times of crisis. To be told that the main thing we need to do is not help each other, is stay away from each other, is very contrary to every instinct. I've been lucky too, because I've got good, useful work to do. We're doing a lot of organizing now online a lot as we head toward Earth Day. And earlier this year, I'd started this newsletter for the New Yorker on the climate crisis. It's turned into a newsletter where the word crisis is the most important, because what we're reflecting on is what we can understand about where we are now from spending the last 30 years thinking about crises, and how this might springboard us into the next 30 years if we were even half smart about it.
Yeah, and I mean, so I guess, do you see, over the last, let's say 2 years or so, I think climate has really entered people's minds in a way that hadn't before that. And I think that was a combination of things, including, Green New Deal, I think there was a lot of things, climate strikes, all that. Does this take away from that, or does this kind of help?
No, I mean, it doesn't. If anything, the opposite. There's several lessons that are very clear right now and very important. One is physical reality is real. That sounds like a hard, obvious thing to say, but I think it's not that obvious. I've spent the last 30 years trying to convince people that chemistry and physics can't be compromised with or negotiated or spun, that the carbon molecule is going to do what it's going to do. And now we're learning in short order that the same is exactly true of biology. It doesn't make any difference if our witless president is up there saying that it's all going to go away, or that the cases are going to go to zero, or the warm weather, there's going to be a miracle, or it doesn't, the COVID microbe could care less. It's going to do what it's going to do. It's what's telling us you have to stay 6 feet apart because biology. Second lesson that I think people are really learning now, and it's sinking in, is when you're faced with situations like this, delay is the stupidest possible option. Look at the coronavirus. The US and South Korea found out on the same day in January that they had their first case. The South Koreans went to work. They imposed some minor disruptions, no big gatherings, and they started testing everybody left, right, and center, over and over again. They're not through the problem, but they're now looking at it through the side view mirror, if not the rear view mirror, right at the moment that it's crashing through our front windshield. And that's because we didn't do anything. And the analog to climate change is perfect. 30 years ago, scientists told us that we were facing a big problem. Had we acted then, there were modest things we could have done. A modest price on carbon that would have steered the economy in an entirely new direction. And 30 years later, we might not have solved climate change, but we'd be close to it. But instead, we decided to double down. And we've released more carbon since 1990 than in all the years before. And so now we have to do things that are deeply disruptive, and we're going to end up with a lot of damage no matter what we do. So hopefully people are picking up that lesson. The main difference between these two crises, one is sort of speed. This one's playing out over weeks and months, not decades. But the second, and the hopeful one for coronavirus, is happily there's not a $1 trillion industry whose job it is to get us all infected with coronavirus. There was a $1 trillion industry whose job it was to keep us burning coal and oil and gas longer than we needed to, and they were very successful. But I think that the final thing that really becomes clear here is that social solidarity is a great thing, a necessary thing in these kind of moments. Ronald Reagan sort of started us down a lot of the ideological paths we're on when he said, You know, the 9 scariest words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Those are not the scariest words in the English language are, "We've run out of ventilators," or "The hillside behind your house is on fire." I mean, those are scary, and the only way to deal with them is to have working governments. Working, you know, government's just our name for, you know, when we come together to do things. So hopefully we're learning a lot of lessons right now.
And kind of following that, you know, do you see the sacrifices that people are making right now over the last, you know, month and a half? Do you think that that makes it more likely that people are willing to make sacrifices for the climate later on, or do you think people will kind of like recoil from having to change their lives in the future?
So the two options are just we're so desperate to get back to normal, and we do whatever it, and you know, that seems to be what at least some of Washington, you know, has in mind. I mean, there are people like giving bailout money to the cruise ship industry so we can, you know, go back to having, you know, floating petri dishes wandering around the high seas, you know. But I think that there are a unique number of people at the moment who are open to the idea that change is possible, who are open to the idea that it's not a good idea to, for instance, not to have tens of millions of uninsured Americans, because then they have to go to work even if they're sick, and then they spread. I mean, that's like the most obvious kind of, but the same kind of thinking now for as we deal with the crises of the future. You don't want to just set up the pins in the bowling alley again. You want to build, I think, an economy and a society that probably is less concerned with rapid growth and more concerned with stability and hardiness and security. I think that there's people are going to put a big premium on those things going forward, would be my guess.
So you're planning events around Earth Day next week, and, you know, kind of events into the future. How are you thinking about impacting, you know, how members of Congress or how state leaders or international leaders are thinking? How do you plan to do that through kind of virtual digital platforms?
Well, so there are 2 targets that the climate movement, I think, has been after in recent times. One of them is political, and people are working hard on that, and they'll be working hard, you know, through the election and so on. I mean, we're in election year. This is an even numbered year. It's, you know, a little unclear how it's all going to work out in terms of elections and things, but it's, you know, it's abundantly clear for climate activists that you've got to get rid of a president and a Senate that repudiated the Paris Climate Accords, walked away from the only effort to do anything, you know, so people are engaged. But the other equally big lever that people are trying to pull is the financial one. People have been working very hard to get the big financial institutions, the banks, the asset managers, the insurance companies, to take climate change seriously. And with really some fairly robust results early on. You know, one of the companies that many people have been targeting for the last year was BlackRock, biggest asset manager on the planet. Something like $1.08 in the world rests in their digital vaults. Wow. And they came out after that pressure with some very strong and interesting language about putting climate change at the center of their thinking going forward. We'll, of course, see how well that plays out, but it's the perfect example of what that kind of movement pressure can build. It's a great, one of the sadnesses of, having that we're all in detention at the moment is that, we'd planned for, I think it would have been a day of kind of breakout mass civil disobedience on April 23rd. I think we would have had civil disobedience in the lobbies of half the 5,000 Chase Bank branches in the country, because Chase Bank is the biggest and most reckless lender to the fossil fuel industry. We can't do that for obvious reasons now, but we can do plenty of other things. And there's going to be a terrific 72-hour online Earth Day live digital commotion next week, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. And if you Google Earth Day Live, you'll see it. It's mostly led by the young people from, Climate Strike and Fridays for the Future. And Alexandria, I'm sure, has tons of details on it. It's going to be good. I'll just note in passing that if you can't go sit in on a Chase Bank lobby like we did in January, but if you have a Chase credit card, and chances are a lot of people do because there's 50 million of them or something floating around, and if you have a pair of scissors and if you have a webcam, then you're well equipped to at least make your point next week at the 50th anniversary of Earth Day.
Excellent. And then what are the, so we've got a group of our future leaders who are now going to be meeting in October instead of 2 weeks ago, which is unfortunate, but it's, the world we live in, which you said detention. I sometimes feel like I'm grounded, which really takes me back. What should they be thinking about? This ranges from college students and graduate students to young working professionals kind of in the energy and climate space. What should they be thinking about both for next week, but also kind of through the summer into the fall as they're figuring out how to make an impact?
Well, I think that the first thing is that clearly there's going to be, we need really smart policy people thinking really hard about how we take the trauma, and it is real trauma, of coronavirus. There's no silver lining to a pandemic, but if we're going to have one, we might as well learn a few things. How we take this moment and build policy going forward. And there's, it's an opening of a kind you don't often get. And the second thing all those young professionals and graduate students and things need to know is right over their shoulder are coming all the current high school students who are really driving the young but highly professional people like Alexandria. We know about Greta Thunberg, and Greta Thunberg is fantastic, and it's been a great joy to get to know her, and it's good to be able to report that she is recovering easily from her brush with coronavirus, and even her dad, who had it quite bad, seems to be well on the mend now. But the good news is there are 10,000 Greta Thunbergs scattered across the planet, and that's the real motive power and future going forward. So the only thing I would say to all the rest of us of all ages is not okay to take the biggest problem the world ever faced and offload it entirely onto the shoulders of high school sophomores. So, the rest of us have our part to do too. But man, I'm glad for that uprising that's shown up in the last few years.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. So why don't we bring in Alexandria and Benjie into the conversation? If we can, there we go. So quick introductions. Alexandria Villaseñor is a 14-year-old climate activist from New York City. She started her first climate strike in December of 2018 and was a leader of the Fridays for Future Global Youth Climate Strike in March of 2019. She's also recently launched her own nonprofit, Uprising International. Benji Backer is the president and founder of the American Conservative Coalition and a senior at the University of Washington. He serves on the Wisconsin Conservative Energy Forum's Leadership Council and is a fellow at the Chapman Center in Seattle. So I want to welcome both of you. So let's start with Alexandria. How are you doing? Where are you isolating from? And, talk a little bit about what you're working on during this period of grounding / detention.
Yeah, definitely. So thank you for having me on the call. I'm currently in Davis, California, actually, right now, where I've been staying at home for the past couple of weeks. I've only left my house a couple of times, and if I do, I just go for a quick walk in the Arboretum here in Davis to get fresh air, to stay reconnected with nature. I've really been focusing on my health and safety because um, during the first couple weeks where quarantine really started, my family ended up getting the virus. Um, so I didn't have it as bad, but my parents did. So we've really been focusing on staying distance and keeping ourselves safe. And so now we're recovering though. And I have been able to focus a lot on activism as well during this time. So one thing that I'm trying to think of this as an opportunity is being able to build relationships at this time. So that way, when we come back from and we're able to go onto the streets again, all of the relationships and this movement will be so much stronger. So for example, the youth climate activists have actually been hosting Zoom parties where all of us will get together on a Zoom call, and there will be there's been some where there's over 100 people on one, so it's very chaotic, but it's the sense of community even though we're far away. So I've just been trying to focus a lot on that and organizing for Earth Week as well, and putting my efforts towards something even though I'm at home.
Excellent. That's fantastic. And good to hear that your family is recovering, or, you know, has recovered at this point. So that's great. So Benji, how about you? What have you been up to? Where are you and what are you working on?
Hey, Greg, thanks so much for having me. And it's a pleasure to be on in person, sort of, with everyone that's here and then everyone who's going to watch this later. I mean, this is a tough time for everyone. And I think that what I've been trying to tell people is that you can't sell your own personal situation short. Of course, there's somebody who has it worse than you. There's always going to be someone who has it worse than you, but we all are going through really tough times. And so I think taking care of yourself is really important during this time, and the people around you, if you live with people around you, as well as the people you can FaceTime and call every day. So I think that each person has their own struggles, and so just trying to work through those here on our end. I'm quarantining in Arizona, and similar to Alexandria, really been trying to find some fresh air. I think one of the things that quarantine has proven to the rest of the globe is that the one thing that we really all want right now is fresh air and the outdoors. And it's something where, if that's the one thing we want, and that's the one thing we can all unify around during coronavirus, then we probably should work on protecting it once coronavirus is over. And so that's been a huge wake-up call, I think, to a lot of people. I mean, you look at the improvements that we've seen in Los Angeles and in other cities across the country and the globe, of course, with pollution. And it's just incredible to see how humans impact the environment. So, been thinking about how we can make a huge difference post-COVID, but during COVID, I think one thing that our generation has in our repertoire that really is helpful is this digital aspect. Every week we've been holding 3 or 4 online events, and we've already been a digital team. My team's 7 full-time and like 55 volunteer staff across the country. We're working probably more than we were before because we can, and because we can be digital, and because we can talk to each other over Zoom, and we can mobilize people and have them write and have them start prepping for once COVID is over and start looking at campaigns. And so I guess, in addition to obviously going outside and taking care of yourself, I think it's really important for our generation and everyone who cares about climate to think about, we've got a lot of time to reflect right now. How can we all make a bigger difference on climate change after COVID, but also during COVID? And how can we keep pushing for the values that we see as really important on these issues? So really excited to be here. And that's kind of been my COVID experience so far, and how climate change has impacted it.
Excellent. And Benji, thinking about the work that you're doing now during the crisis and kind of planning for post-COVID less distancing, more in-person kinds of things. So how are you thinking about that? How does the American Climate Contract play into that? What is your organization, how are you designing kind of the next year or so of the work you plan on doing?
Yeah, so we are launching a climate change framework next week called the American Climate Contract. And it's obviously going to be launched during Earth Week, the 50th anniversary. And really what it comes down to is that we think that, especially once COVID is over, what this time has proven is that we need to focus on solutions and not necessarily disruption. We have to back up our beliefs and our frustrations on this issue with candid and bold, but also respectful conversations on Capitol Hill and with companies and with state legislatures across the country. And we need to make things tangible for people. Climate change is alarming, but that sort of, alarming mentality hasn't really worked. And we have to be able to come up with things that people can understand. So if you're in Colorado, you've seen the Colorado River dry up, or if you're in California, you've seen wildfires get worse. There's different areas of the country that have seen different effects of climate change, and you have to make it tangible, and you also have to make it able you have to make it so people are able to engage with whatever they directly are caring about. And so for us, the American Climate Contract does that. And so we can't really wait for some, big policy right now. We have to start taking steps in the right direction right now. And we can't, in my opinion, we can't wait for, really any policy, including the Green New Deal. And so we need action right now. And I think that's something everyone on this call can agree on, is that we need action right now. And so some of the American Climate Contract is meant to unite both sides together to say, for the first time ever, you can put together the Young Republican National Federation, which has endorsed our climate contract, and the traditional environmental organizations that are supporting our contract as well. And so I think at the end of the day, what the American Climate Contract proves is that you can have, the protests in the streets that are so important, but you have to back that up with these candid policy conversations that people feel the pressure on. And most importantly, need to be backed up by voting, because that's something that our generation has just not done a great job on. So, the American Climate Contract is super exciting. It's definitely not the end all be all. There's so many great ideas out in the climate space, but we have a huge opportunity in 2020 ahead of the election to say, this is our number one issue as a generation, and that Republicans, Democrats, independents, apolitical people can all say that this is something that we need to come together on.
Excellent, thank you. Alexandria, how are you thinking about climate strikes now during this period, and then what that might look like kind of post-COVID? And then also, can you talk a little bit about Uprising International?
So I think that right now, the current climate strike movement during this time, we have gone through a lot of reflection. So how can we take action while at home? So we've started to have these conversations like, what makes a demonstration, and what do you need to have a demonstration, and how can you do that either virtually or online? So we've started to bring up these conversations so we can have new angles during this. And I think that that's what's important for us at this time, is to really think about the movement and what we've seen over this past year and how to change our tactics. And I think that that's, at this time, it's the perfect way to look at how social media can have a role in it, how any different angle would help. I think that the climate movement will continue to grow after this in different ways. We'll still be striking, but I think that more young people will be focusing on other areas of climate activism. So with Earth Uprising, one thing that I'm focusing on is climate education. So I think that right now, after seeing how many young people mobilized for climate strikes, I still saw that a lot of young people weren't going onto the streets and they weren't getting involved just because there was a lack of knowledge about what was happening to our planet. A lot of schools, they don't teach you about climate education. Usually you just learn about reduce, reuse, recycle, and that's not enough to save our planet at this point. And so education is a key solution. And so that's why Earth Uprising will be taking that approach in this next year, educating young people, but doing it peer-to-peer. So classmates, your community, your friends. And that way, once people know the science, then they feel more empowered to take action. And that brings young people to the solutions area. It brings them to the area where they feel comfortable to stand up, protest, and do other sorts of actions. And so I think that that is the main focus in the next year for me, is education and action.
Excellent, fantastic. So I want to bring Bill back in and ask all three of you a question. And Bill, we can start with you. Is, what are you most looking forward to in the next 12 months in terms of opportunities to make real change? Do you think that there's, for example, do you think that the infrastructure bill that Congress is sort of talking about right now, an opportunity to actually decarbonize, or do you think it's business as usual, or do you think that the election is really the next opportunity for
Look, none of this is doable or possible until the Trump administration is gone. That's at this point obvious. Look what they've been doing in the middle of the coronavirus crisis. Doing everything they can to roll back every environmental regulation we have, the kind of level of recklessness and corruption and vested interest and anti-scientific. No American should ever forget that the country that put more carbon into the atmosphere than any other is now, thanks to Donald Trump, also the only country in the world not taking part in the only global effort to slow down climate change. Until they're gone, it's going to be very difficult to get anything out of Washington. We can do all kinds of work elsewhere, in states, in localities, dealing with financial community, which we can talk more about. But I think for the moment, that's probably job number one. It's an even numbered year, and we're 6 months out now from a momentous election. And if we want to move at any kind of serious pace, that's probably first thing that needs to happen.
Excellent. Benji?
Yeah, I think the thing that I'm most excited for is for our generation to come together on these issues. This summer, the National Audubon Society and ACC are going to be working on a cross-partisan event with 100 conservative students and 100 liberal students coming together to push for climate action ahead of the 2020 election. That's not going to be the first time or the last time you hear about both sides coming together amongst young people. Obviously, the election plays a huge role no matter what side of the fence you stand on. And we're going to have to push for climate action in a very large way during the election, because it's an important thing. And I guess I would disagree with Bill a little bit that just because there's someone in the White House doesn't mean that we can't get things done. It's not just about the president. And obviously I have severe differences with the president on climate change. But there's a lot of potential for state action. There's a lot of potential for congressional action. There's a lot of potential for corporate action, for local action and global action as well. Really everything stems from local and state and congressional action. And that's where we have to push, I think, most of the time. I think too often we get hung up, with the president, and obviously there are some serious problems there, but we've got a lot of other opportunities. And so the election is bigger than just the president. I think we have to figure out who we want in our local legislature, in our state legislature, and in the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate. So I think those things are really important to me. And also translating, everyone knows that climate change is a generational issue for our generation. This is something that our generation sees as at least a top 3 issue overall, usually the top issue. But we need to translate that into votes. We need to translate that into letters to Capitol Hill. We need to translate that into better consumer choices, and really start changing it ourselves, because we can't wait for the right president and we can't wait for the right, Senate majority. We can do things when we have the opportunities to. And so I will say that I have a little bit of hope, because I think that coronavirus has woken us up to the fact, to many, that we have a huge impact on our environment. And I think that we've got a huge opportunity to capitalize on that and get more people involved in the climate movement than ever before.
Alexandria?
What was the question again?
What are you most looking forward to over the next year? What do you think, what are the areas where you think we can have the most impact?
Yeah, well, I definitely think that this next year, we're going to see a lot more change happening from young people rising up. I think that the climate movement, when the climate strikes first started, it was young people's first wake-up call. So you started to see young people striking every Fridays on the streets. You saw these global climate strikes where young people came all together internationally, all around the world, and especially when there were big climate summits happening like COP or the United Nations Climate Summit. And so I think that that was the first step for young people to get involved and find their voice. I think the climate strike movement was the way where young people got involved in activism, because before it, a lot of young people had trouble finding out how to make their voice heard. And so now I think that it's finding an outlet for them to feel comfortable making their voice heard in the area that they want to do. I think that there will be more digital groups, especially during the pandemic. They will start popping up. So digital climate groups that will start working on education conferences, digital climate strikes, of course. One thing that I'm really looking forward to in this next year is the actions that young people will take, turning actions into solutions area. So starting to work on their own policies, because I've seen young people get really upset that they were never taught climate education. And some young people live in conservative areas where their friends, even their family, don't believe in climate change. And so they themselves feel more empowered now, and they want to start getting that action and seeing that education in their community. So making sure that young people have the resources to start working on their own policies themselves, because we won't have time till young people are in the positions to be our new political leaders. We don't have time to wait for that. So that means that we have to start being those political leaders now. We have to start working on policies and areas where we can make change in our community. And so this next year, especially after the pandemic, I think that more young people will start to see the passion that they feel and what they want to do.
Excellent. And I have one more question for all three of you before we turn to some questions from our audience. And we're getting a lot of questions, and so we're sorting through them and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. Climate anxiety and climate stress is real. And so how are you handling kind of the anxiety from, spending most or all of your days, day and night, thinking about climate change and what we have to do to get there, on top of the anxiety and stress from the COVID crisis? And what advice do you have for the others on the call for kind of dealing with those things? So whoever wants to start.
Well, I'll just say a word or two, because I've had 30 years of getting to think about and deal with kind of the stress of climate stuff, which means long before Benji or Alexandria were born, and every once in a while, old people have some utility in this stuff. I mean, look, it is and should be depressing and hard to deal with at some level, because it's a frustrating reality. And of course, the part that makes you crazy, that really frustrates you in the end, is the degree to which our current plights unnecessary. I mean, we know now from great investigative reporting that the fossil fuel industry knew everything there was to know about climate change back in the 1980s, and just systematically set about lying about it. And that's why one of the big reasons we're in the hole we're in. So one way of saying that is the best reliever of stress and anxiety is figuring out how to take effective action. And so figuring out how to, how to make BlackRock or Chase or someone, how to force them to change what they're doing. I mean, that feels useful on the scale that we now need to be useful. One of the hard truths of where we are at the moment is that while it's very important for everybody to do things in their own individual lives to change, we can't one individual action after another win this fight. We're going to have to make some basic structural shifts. And so just to sort of realize that and get to work gives you something to hold on to. I think it would be desperately hard to know about this and not have some way into it, some way to work with it.
Benji or Alexandria?
I think that during this time staying at home, I have felt more climate anxiety than usual. One thing that was really upsetting for me is during this time, there's an Indigenous activist and her town was hit by a flood. And I think that, they were trying to stay safe, of course, from social distancing, but it's hard to social distance and protect yourself if something's happening to your community like that, where you all have to work together. And so seeing that and seeing how even if we are stuck in home because of the coronavirus, the climate crisis is still hitting communities all around the world. And so being at home, that scared me for a little while, especially because it's hard to think of actions to do during this time. But I started to, well, of course, build my connections, start talking to other activists, really be there for each other. And then I started to think about actions I can take at home, because ever since I started becoming an organizer, I started to see my climate anxiety getting better because I was doing something to protect my future. I was actively striking and organizing. And so now I've started to think of ways to take action at home. So the digital climate strikes and upcoming to Earth Week, being part of Earth Day Live, finding ways to share our stories and an outlet to share our stories about what's happening in our communities. And so once I take action, I find myself feeling better. And so I've been finding myself putting a lot more time into organizing in quarantine.
Excellent. And, you mentioned the flood. One of the reasons that we're doing our first Innovators digital event is with Melissa from the American Flood Coalition, is because we're coming up on hurricane season, and it's really hard to, we ask people to evacuate, and if a hurricane's coming in, it's really hard to do that and social distance at the same time. So that's a really good point. Benji?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think Bill and Alexandria hit on some really great points about how we, as a generation and as people who are worried about climate change, the best way to calm anxiety is to take action. And we have a lot of opportunities even during quarantine. I could even say there are just as many, because you can post on social media more. You can contact your legislator even more than before. There's so many online ways to contact your legislator, and obviously calling and writing letters. You can do those things because we have the time to do them. You can coalesce people in a way that you weren't able to before. You can write op-eds and letters to the editor to your local paper more than you could before. I mean, there's so many ways to still stay engaged in this topic and to get your thoughts onto paper and get your thoughts onto into the public world, the public eye, and it feels good when you feel like you're doing something about the problems that you're worried about. The other thing is that I think that there's a lot of reason to be hopeful. I'm an optimist, but I think we're taking steps in the right direction every single day. And I mean, States, the world emission reduction last year again, and we're working really hard on the global level. The United Kingdom has been doing a lot, and obviously a lot of Europe has been lowering their emissions. And so it's obviously it's not like, peaches and cream. Obviously there's still a lot of work to be done, and that should not calm our activism at all. But I think it would say that what we're doing is working, and that our consumer choices and our voting choices and that our push for action is working. And so when you're in this time, as anxious as you might be, think about the positives and how this is an issue that can unite people and that can actually, spur action through cross-partisan and cross-ideological conversations, but B, that we're actually, headed in the right direction in a lot of ways. And of course, there are, not necessarily all of the countries and all of the world is heading in the right direction, but we are headed in the right direction. And so I feel like there is a lot of opportunity during coronavirus to take that anxiety, put it to action, and reflect on what we can all do when we come back from this crisis to be even more effective than we were before. And I actually applaud Alexandria a lot for saying that. I mean, because when you have this time, it's, we can't come back with the same old. We have to come back with new innovative ideas for action. And this is a great time to maybe push the reset button and say, okay, what did we do before? How did it work? How did it not work? How can we improve what we were doing before coronavirus and make it more effective post-coronavirus? And that's the best way to calm any climate anxiety that's out there.
Excellent. Well, thank you. I'm going to take, we have a couple questions that that our audience has submitted. The first one's for Alexandria. This is from Sean. What were your biggest challenges in organizing the first global youth climate strike, and what would you recommend for someone who wants to organize similar events kind of during this time? And I know you already kind of talked about this, but what's the advice you have for new organizers in the space?
Well, yeah, definitely. Well, I think first we're thinking back to the first ever global climate strike. It was my first time organizing ever to organize something that big, where a climate strike, where people would actually come and show up to an organized event. Because before I'd just go and take a sign and protest at the UN. I'd never actually organized a protest before. And so I did a lot of learning on the way to March 15th, that first ever global climate strike. There were days where I had just meetings with all of these other organizations in New York City, asking them advice, like, how do I do this? Talking about all of the logistics of it, permits, outreach, everything that, an organizer would soon to learn. And so I think that the advice that I would give someone who's starting to get involved or starting to organize is that you learn along the way. I think that the more time you spend organizing, the more you learn. And I also think that relationships, when you're organizing for protests, I think that building coalition and working with other organizations and groups is so important, to have that collective effort, because there are so many different organizations out there. I think that the climate movement is this vast ecosystem of organizations that focus on different areas, but they're all needed. And so if you're holding a protest, make sure you have those different ideas in there, have those different organizations collaborating with you. And that way you get the best action and the best solutions from it.
Excellent, thank you. And Benji, a question for you is, how do you find out more about the American Climate Contract, and where will the information be released? And this is from Melissa.
Great question. So on our website, www.acc.eco, you can sign up to be the first to learn about the contract and get it in your inbox. It's also just going to be on our social media at ACC_national. So just feel free to follow along there. And I think that, this is going to be a long-term push. This American Climate Contract is going to be something that we continue to push for decades to come. It's going to be relevant for decades to come, because this is going to be a multi-decade long issue that we are continually fighting and trying to suppress in climate change. I also just quickly want to also acknowledge once again Alexandria's great point about building relationships and coalitions. It's all about that in this space. I think when I got into this as a young person, you kind of want to demand answers right away, right? You want to be able to say, Senator blank, pass this bill right now because I care a lot. And what I found, and that's what I was doing for a while. And I, when I went to travel, I wouldn't take time to go meet with activists because I just thought I should just go straight to the beast. And what with activists and meeting with people and building that relationship and building a coalition of people to stand together is the most powerful thing you can do as a climate activist or an activist in any issue. And so that's also the same approach that you have to take with the legislators and the decision makers, is bringing them into the fold so that they feel like they're welcome and that they feel like, they're being pressured to do something like an activist would be within a coalition, but that they feel like they're going to be supported if they do take that action. And I think that that's an amazing point Alexandria made about how that's also such a fulfilling part. I mean, the amount of amazing people that I have met through the activism, through the American Conservation Coalition, and the amount of amazing people who have reached out and said, I want to join the American Climate Contract is incredible. And they are some of the best people in the entire world. And they're the next generation of leaders. And so I think that that's a really great point ahead of, post-COVID, is meet as many people as you can, coalesce as many people as you can, and then of course sign up for things that you believe in. And if you like, even just me talking about the American Climate Contract and that piques your interest, we'd love to have you as well.
Bill, a question from Natasha for you is, what do you think we can do as individuals to move the financial sector? Do you believe switching banks to more to banks that aren't invested in fossil fuels, does that work? And or is it more about the activism kind of behind getting them to change what they're doing?
So I think that there's a fair amount of it that has to be done through activism, simply because these institutions are so huge. It takes a strong signal. Chase is a $1 trillion corporation. So, unless you're Jeff Bezos, they're probably not going to notice too much when you move your checking account someplace else. But they have a great deal to lose from organized opposition. And that's because their brand, their reputation is a really important, and this is especially true with younger people. If you're a bank, for instance, you have tons of market research indicating that the first credit card that someone takes out is likely to be one that they keep and use for much of their life. So if if Alexandria has 10,000 young people across America saying, we're not going to forget it, we're not banking with Chase. I mean, we don't want to be with the company whose lead director, Lee Raymond, used to be the CEO at ExxonMobil, where he helped invent corporate climate denial. We're just not down for that, that scares them, if there are people showing up in their lobbies and sitting down, that scares them. And if we scare them enough and pressure them enough, then, it's not like they're going to become, Alexandria's, but it gives the Benjis of the world some chance to go in and work with them a little bit if someone's softened them up some. So I think I think usually the biggest work to be done is outside. There's always tons of people willing to work on the inside once people have changed the zeitgeist, once people have made it necessary for powers that be to change. But we need a lot more activism, especially around these financial institution targets, and we're beginning to get it. I'll just say one of the best examples of this has been the 8-year fight over divestment, which has really become a huge thing. We're at $12 trillion now in endowments and portfolios that have divested, and you can tell that it's working because, well, when the coal industry lined up for their bailout last week, wanted some of that sweet taxpayer money. they said, we need it because divestments made it impossible for us to go raise money on our own. Big shout out to the hundreds of thousands of students around America on college campuses, really around the world, who pressed hard for that and won huge victories, like the University of California system divesting last autumn.
And here's one last question kind of for all three of you is how, this is from Kitty, how can we work to bridge the divides within the climate movement, kind of between parties, generations, geographies, and what are each of you doing to kind of bring people together within the movement?
Yeah, I guess I can speak a little towards that. Coming from the youth activist side, one gap I saw a lot was the gap between young people and adults. And so that's a lot why I did start Earth Uprising, is because in Earth Uprising, one thing that I really want to see is a collaboration between youth activists and adults and scientists, because one thing that about the climate movement that I always loved is that we were basically shouting out the science. I think that scientists and activists have this collaboration that is really necessary, because you need activists to go out there and act and push out the science, but you need scientists to actually find out what's happening so that we can get the word out there. So there's a certain collaboration and partnership that happens there. And so I think that that is one of the most important partnerships and ways to bridge the gap, is between the young people and adults, and have this intergenerational activism, because adults are the ones in positions of power right now. And so having adult allies who are there to advocate for you in those rooms is really important. Then you need the youth to be out there to making this message even louder, because youth are very consistent. I've said in the past that I think that young people, we are very stubborn. Teenagers are known for being stubborn, but we should use that for good and cultivate that so that we can use it for anything we're passionate about, whether it be climate activism or any other subject that we think that we're really passionate about. And so just be stubborn with your actions, and that is the way to see activism. And I think that in this next year, you're going to start to see more intergenerational activism.
Bill or Benji?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that's a great question, and there's a lot of there's a lot of division amongst different groups of individuals, including older and younger generations, that has to be bridged to fix this issue. The two that I think are really important in addition to that are the geographic and the political. On the geographic side, there was actually just recent data from Duke that showed this week, and Michigan, the University of Michigan has showed it too, that rural Americans are more environmentally conscious than urban Americans in the way that they look at their environment, because they live in it and they know how important taking care of it is. If you're a farmer, you know how important taking care of your land is, because it's literally your life. Like that is how you make your money, and you struggle every single day to make that happen. And if your environment is rotten, then your crops are rotten and you are screwed. And so, I think trying to reach out to the different geographies of America is really important. I also think that taking into consideration how different climate change is to people in Louisiana compared to somebody in Washington State, where I live, is, really important as well, because, the way that Washington State handles climate change is a lot different than the way Louisiana can handle climate change, and the effects are a lot different as well. So the geographical side is really different. And then the political side, I would say the first thing you have to understand is that most people are not ill-intentioned. And if anything, they're ill-informed, but most people are going in with really good intentions with whatever issue they want. I mean, everyone who's watching here has good intentions, and we all are fairly good people overall. Of course, there are exceptions. And so I think that when you go into a political conversation, especially with just an everyday person, don't see them as the enemy just because you might differ with them on the politics. I've found so much hope in meeting so many, left of center people who 10 years ago, when I was starting to get active in politics, I would have thought people all left of center were like, terrible people. And now I just know that they're just as great as the rest of us. And, I think that's when you're trying to build that divide, going in with the notion that, okay, these people just have a different viewpoint on things. That doesn't mean that they're bad people. That doesn't mean that they don't believe in the same things in the end that I do. And I think most people want a clean environment. Most people want clean air. Most people want clean water. And actually today in 2020, most people believe in climate change. So let's build those divides, or let's bridge those divides and actually get something done, instead of saying, okay, that person doesn't agree with me on some other issue, so I'm not going to work with them. So geographical and political divides are so important to bridge. We will not solve climate change at all if we don't bridge the geographic and political divides.
Bill, final thoughts?
And I'll just add that everybody should always keep in mind when they talk about climate change that the iron law of it is the people who did the least to cause it get hit first and hardest. What we're really talking about is justice, and that's one of the reasons why it's important to think about this in a holistic sense. Two things have spiked in our world in the last 30 years, 40 years. One of them is the temperature, and the other is the level of inequality on this planet. And they've come in many ways from the same source, a kind of endless devotion to the idea that markets are somehow automatically going to solve all problems and so on and so forth, that we don't need to do the hard work of being neighbors and citizens. And so I'm very glad that there are people like Alexandria and Benjie who are willing to do that work, and always remembering that we do it best when we do it with people who are on the front lines of these fights, the people who have the kind of deepest knowledge. That's why it's been really both wrenching and exciting in the last week to see first the fossil fuel industry and the Trump administration trying to ram through the Keystone Pipeline under cover of the pandemic, truly agonizing and disgusting, and why it was very exciting to see yesterday a federal court say that they couldn't do it for the moment, that they'd been disobeying the law. And Faith Spotted Eagle, leader of the Yankton Sioux, said it was like in our strange moment, a kind of little outbreak of justice. And I felt that too. This is a big, broad, sprawling movement. And if we can keep building it and keep it focused and keep punching hard at those forces that for 30 years have kept us from doing anything, then we've got a chance. Not a guarantee, because we're pretty far down, and we waited a long time to get going. So no guarantees, but if we do everything we can, we'll be better off than if we don't. And that's the lesson about delay that we're learning these last crazy few weeks. So God hopes we'll take some of it with us. Thank you guys so much for good work all around.
And I just want to thank Bill, Benji, and Alexandria, and the tens of thousands of people that you each work with on this, for participating in this and for all the work that you've been doing. Check out our virtual event next week on Earth Day on Wednesday, and we'll talk to everyone soon. Thanks, everyone.
God bless.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.